Reach to Teach is a series of 6 online sessions developed at the George Washington University by Professors Heller, Hoffman, and Taragas under a grant from the Department of Defense. Any use of the material in these slides should acknowledge the university, the authors, the granting agency, and the grant number. But first, we have to review your homework. Case studies can be ripped from the headlines or a figment of your imagination. You are to structure a case study, real or imaginary, that is designed as the basis for class discussion. Be sure to include a story, a compelling problem, leading questions to jumpstart your discussion. So that was your homework. And how did you answer it? What did you think of? Did you think of the story of the Morris worm? Here's the story. A long, long time ago, when there were only about 100,000 computers and very few of them were on any sort of connectivity or, quote, internet, Robert Morris, who was a graduate student, was investigating the network. He unleashed a program that later was called a worm that wasn't discovered quickly because nobody was looking and caused tremendous damage. The problem is we are still plagued by hackers. So here's the question. Are there lone actors today? And who bears the responsibility for them? Here are some objectives for today's lesson, and we have none on community colleges or ethics, but only on the pedagogy of questions and discussions. So you should be able to distinguish between an open and a closed question and an open and a closed discussion. You'll be able to revise closed questions into open ones. You should be able to explain the value of discussion in classroom. And finally, you will be able to identify at least 2 techniques for curtailing off-topic discussions. But first, a few words about preparing for your first day. And here are some tips. Be sure you have signed all employment forms at the university and at your agency. Get all your identity badges. Get all your identification materials. Meet with your department chairman or previous faculty to see what syllabuses they use and what tricks or techniques they prefer. Be sure to get a copy of the university calendar. Learn the rules about canceling a course, makeup exams, grading. Find out about parking, the most important thing on the list for sure. So at the end of the reference session for this section, there are some links to journals that will help you address these topics. I'm not going to go into the topics themselves, but ethical questions are interesting and worth investigating on your own. And here's a list of a few, and you can use the references at the end as a jumping off point. What are some of the major ethical issues confronting faculty in community colleges? What guidance do the current literature give you in addressing these issues? What formal guidelines exist regarding professional ethics for faculty who work in community colleges? And are they similar or different from four-year colleges or from your own profession? And finally, are there research gaps between the ethics and the teaching in community colleges? And how should those gaps be eliminated? And again, the references at the end of this session might give you some leads on where to go. But let's focus on teaching with discussions. The difference between a discussion and a textbook. So a textbook, I would say, is a static piece of information. You turn the pages. You might engage with it in that you're reading and taking notes, but it isn't an exchange, whereas a discussion is really an exchange between and among the students and the teachers for the specific purpose of thinking about a question, learning more about it, understanding a problem, solving it. Discussions increase a student's accountability because they have to be prepared for a discussion, engage students in active learning. They can't sit passively by, and stimulate thinking. But none of these happen if a discussion isn't prepared in advance and well thought through. So let's talk about two different kinds of discussions. I call them open discussions and closed discussions. Open discussions, you can see the faculty member does very little talking. They set the question, not unlike the Morris Worm question, and then the students do the talking. They talk out loud, they talk to each other, they are really in control. A closed discussion, however, it's the faculty member doing all the talking, and the students do very little talking. To me, a closed discussion is more like a question and answer period than a discussion itself. So how do we create this? Questions, too, are open and closed. A closed question yields a yes or no answer. An open question requires some sort of more detailed response. And the art of asking a question relies on making sure it's an open question. So let's think about a closed question. Did you do problem 6? An open version of that would be, how did you solve problem 6? Now, there is a joke. Little comedians will say that a parent says to the child, where did you go? That's an open question. And the child replies, out. And what did you do? And the child, probably a teenager, says, nothing. But in general, open questions really give you more detailed information. So your trick is to always ask open questions. So now we're going to teach with discussions. We've already talked about open and closed questions, so make sure the questions are open, ask them clearly, and students answer questions more when they feel confident. Now, where does that confidence come from? It comes from understanding the rules of the discussion, understanding the topic, making sure that the statement that the student has just said is encouraged. I agree. I think it's more likely that this was caused by that. I think that what you just said makes a lot of sense. Make sure that you have room for students to ask an additional question. Do you still have a question that you'd like to have answered? Let the students know that we're getting it. Use your body language, nod, encourage, Look your students in the eye when they're talking. And sometimes just being quiet after you ask the question to give the students time to think is a good idea. I usually try to hold my tongue for a good 45 to 60 seconds. That's a big challenge. So, some professor characteristics to have a good discussion. First of all, you have to be open. You have to be willing to hear views that might be problematic, you might not agree with. You might think, oh, no, I could never say that. You have to be also open to students who make incorrect claims and be able to correct them in a gentle and informative way. And you have to be able to moderate the discussion, which means you have to stay paying attention. If it requires notes, writing a little chart of who's chatted, who's responded, and who hasn't, so that you can encourage an additional student to join in, or to moderate it to say, thank you, Tom, for your opinion. Let's give someone else a chance for a student who has taken over the discussion. Look for the students who are being quiet. Moderate the discussion with another open question if it's going off topic. And cut it off after a while. I would not let a discussion go for an entire class period. So, launching a discussion. Here's a very interesting video from the ACLU. You can share it with your students and use the video as a discussion jumping off point. Again, once you've finished watching the video, click on the advance the slide to the next topic. Now, we don't have another session, but I thought it would be a good idea to form some homework anyway. Discussions are a good way to start a news section or provide closure on a topic. Suppose you were teaching a session on password protection. Choose a discussion either as an opening discussion to launch the topic or a closing discussion as a summary. Frame the question and describe how you would sustain the discussion. Consider these situations. You might have students who are uneager to talk or discuss at all, or a student who wants to carry on the entire session. We've talked a little bit about how to engage students by keeping a roster in front of you or in your head, or asking a student a pointed, open question. And it's also tricky, but sometimes you do have to curtail a student. Here we go, the last part of engaging students. Here's a case study. Emerging Information Technology is a required course in Information Technology Master of Science program at a specific university. This class examines the issues surrounding many new and emerging technologies such as virtual reality, web-based education, and artificial intelligence. These technologies bring with them a rich collection of controversies for discussion. In addition, the field is inhabited by a wide range of colorful and vocal personalities with equally varied viewpoints, from ultra-conservative to downright radical. Because the course is taught in a 12-week term, it's not possible to require readings that would allow the students to acquaint themselves with all these personalities, while at the same time reading the more academic materials necessary to understand the field. So, how would you take charge here? How would you enliven this course with all of these discussions from these lively personalities? What about an expert panel? This should be kind of tricky because you'd have to bring them from across the country. So how might you handle that in an emerging information technologies course? Good job. And finally, an assessment. Are discussions a good assessment measure? Before you click on the video, think about your thoughts to this question. This video is a little bit focused on K-12, but you could create student pairs to accomplish the same impact as described in the video. And as we come to
my first day teaching as an adjunct in the computer technologies area, especially in cyber, was actually pretty seamless. It went like I perfectly well had expected. I had planned incessantly for everything that I would do. I took all of the best parts of the content from the introductory day, every skill I had ever learned from any professor that I loved in the past, all of my education, and poured it all into that day. And everything went perfectly well, as did probably the entire rest of my first semester. I know that's not a lot of excitement to really talk about, but I think my biggest lesson learned there was preparation is the key to everything. And as you get to be a little bit more confident in what you do, you tend to take your own level of preparation for granted. So you got to watch that. So what I wish I had actually known on that first day is that first days wouldn't always be that seamless, and that I shouldn't have learned to take for granted that everything would just go as smoothly as planned. Because certainly you're going to always end up with some kind of issue to troubleshoot, or classroom management technique to overcome, or administrative challenge that everyone needs to tackle together. So I would say my biggest advice overall is to never assume that the days will mirror one another. Be prepared for anything.